web design sits on the intersection, kind of like a Venn diagram of design, technology, and then business. Most people who have a website, it serves some kind of a business purpose. The most obvious one is like an e-commerce shop, right? It's your website, but it's also a shop. If it's designed badly, people are not going to buy. So it's critical that it's good design, that it loads fast, that people understand where to click and where to buy and how to check out, and that it inspires enough trust so people actually put in their credit card. Understanding the business goals and how the website fits into the client's business strategy is an important part of the web design process before we even get to the visual side of things.
Motion design, web design, and product design are three different industries that have quite a bit of overlap. And I think there's a ton of opportunity out there for motion designers looking to expand their work outside of the traditional linear world of animation. So to learn about all of this, I invited my buddy Ron Segall on the podcast. Ron is the founder and CEO of Flux Academy, an incredible online school for web designers who want to learn Webflow, Figma, Framer, and much more. If you're looking for a new area to explore in design that could potentially turn into a new source of gigs or a new role, you're gonna love this episode. Now let's meet Ron. Ron, first of all, it's awesome to talk to you. Last time we talked, we were actually in Israel having this awesome meal in Tel Aviv, and now we're doing it over the internet. It's not as good, but I'm happy you're here, man.
Always good to chat.
I want to introduce you to the School of Motion audience who may not be familiar. Everyone in the world of Webflow and web design knows who you are, but my audience probably doesn't. So I just love a little background here. Who are you? How did you end up running Flux Academy?
Cool. So first of all, thanks for having me and awesome to chat. I'm a designer by trade. So I used to be a freelancer, worked in agencies, worked in startups. I was dabbling in everything, kind of like web design, brand design, app design, like product design. I was doing a lot of things. At some point, I started documenting my process on YouTube, kind of like doing vlogs and showing my client work and my processes. And that evolved into doing courses. And I think not very different from how you rolled into this, but from the video perspective.
Yeah, that's pretty straightforward. Okay, so let's linger a little bit on your early experience. So you said you were working at startups. Were you on staff? Were you freelancing? Like, what actually were you doing at these startups?
Yeah, at the beginning I was in-house working as basically a product designer and a brand designer in like tech. Tech is pretty big here in Tel Aviv. So worked in-house and then quit, started freelancing. And then by that point, I already had kind of like a big network. So I was mainly freelancing with other startups. Mostly early stage, so they needed everything. They didn't have anything, so everything from investor decks, branding, logo, website, their app, everything. So those were mainly, I called myself like a full stack designer. I try to do everything. I know you're also big on stacking skills, and I was also doing that from my perspective.
Yeah, so let's define some of these terms because I frankly am not even quite sure what some of them really mean. I know my audience probably won't. So you said you were doing a product design, you were doing brand design. What's the difference between those two things?
Originally, when I got out of school, I worked in a branding agency. Branding is basically companies come to you, either they're scratch, they don't have anything, they don't have a name, they don't have a logo, they don't have a visual language, so they don't have anything. Or companies come to you with like, we hate how we look, we're doing some change, strategic change, we need to do a rebrand, so we need fresh new look or maybe a new name or kind of like. So that's the process of understanding the company and building, a design strategy for them, like what their colors look like, what their typography looks like, all of their kind of like visual language. That's what we call branding. For me personally, I was doing that, and some of our clients were startups. And as I was working with them and helping them with their brand, they were starting to ask me other questions like, so what do you think our app should look like, right? So that got me into what's called product design. Some people call it UX, UI design. That's a little bit of a different kind of like thinking, a little bit of a different design process, because while branding is mostly strategic, marketing, visual, product design is a lot more kind of like logical. There's now flow, there's now users who are trying to accomplish some tasks. So you have to think about different scenarios, different screens, different, edge cases. You now have to work within, the boundaries of some kind of a device, whether that's computer screen or a mobile phone. So that's a little bit of a different skill, which we call product design. Again, some people call it UX, UI design. So that's that. And then, as I've said, I've moved working in-house in a startup, but then all of these companies also need a website. And a website is somewhere in the intersection between a marketing, right? It's a brand. It's how we present ourselves to the world and tell our story. But it's also has the aspect of user experience because, it's a website, you click, you move between different pages. So while it's not as complicated as a full app that has features and, different, tasks that you can do, it's more simple. You consume information. So web design is somewhere in between. So it's kind of like a different skill set, and it's really interesting. It sits between, again, technology and marketing and business. So that's how I rolled into these core, I would say, 3 core areas of design: web design, brand design, and product design. And now mostly in Flux Academy, we focus on web design, but we do also cover brand design because, again, most people who need a website come to you. They don't have a brand. They don't know how, they don't have the tools that you need. I assume it's the same with motion designers, right? If a client comes to you for a project, you do need to have some kind of assets, like what are your colors, what font do you use? Do you use illustration, or do you use photography, or what kind of illustration? So you need to have some kind of a tool set to work with, and so we have to teach designers how to handle that part of the process.
Right. Okay. Those are really good points. So you brought something up that I think motion designers. This is probably one key difference between, I think, the world of the average motion designer and the world of the average web designer or product designer. So if a client comes to us and they have a logo, but they don't have like a fully fleshed out brand, but they need a 30-second spot or something, cool. So the motion designer can like execute that. Most of the time, this is changing slightly, but like most of the time, the job of the motion designer is to make something that the client thinks will work and is beautiful, right? It seems, and tell me if I'm wrong, it seems to me if you're a web designer, and especially if you're a product designer, what you're designing ideally needs to look really pretty, but it also has to function and solve a certain problem. And it seems like there's a little bit closer of a connection between the business problem and the web designer versus the business problem and the motion designer. So maybe you could talk about that a little bit and how, you have to be a good designer, but it seems like you also kind of need to understand your client's business maybe a little deeper.
Yeah, for sure. So I've actually mentioned that, the web design sits on the intersection, kind of like a Venn diagram of design, technology, and then business. Because as you said, most people who have a website, it serves some kind of a business purpose. The most obvious one is like an e-commerce shop, right? Mm-hmm. It's your website, but it's also a shop. If it's designed badly, people are not going to buy, right? So it's critical that it's good design, that it loads fast, that people understand where to click and where to buy and how to check out, and that it inspires enough trust so people actually put in their credit card. So, and that's an extreme use case, but most other website has other goals, whether it's lead generation or, again, building trust or educating people about a product or a service. So yeah, understanding the business goals and how the website fits into the client's business strategy is an important part of the web design process before we even get to the visual side of things.
Yeah. And so, how is that? Because I think Flux Academy and School of Motion, we're both doing, like this business model has been around for a little while now, where traditionally these are skills that would have been taught at like a private art school somewhere. In web design, maybe, there are schools now that teach it, but maybe there's also these expensive boot camps you can go take. And what I always found was that those programs, they might be really, really good, but they tend to not focus on those business things you're talking about. Like if you're doing a website that needs to generate leads, you kind of need to understand what a sales funnel is and how lead magnets work and things like that. So where did you learn that stuff? And then is that also what you're teaching your students?
Where did I learn that? Number one, as I've mentioned, because I worked in-house in a company, I understood the whole funnel and I was part of the whole process, from how people get to our website and then they download the app and what happens inside of the app and how do they convert and how they eventually turn into money, right? So I was part of all of that. And then when I started freelancing, besides that, I always had side projects, right? So I did my own app for fun. And then I opened up another side business called New School with like 2 partners. And then I had my own SaaS business. And by doing these, you can call them side hustle or side projects, I was basically running my own business and understanding the whole funnel. And that later translated into my ability to help my clients build these funnels and understand how they need to structure it. So I understood it because I was not only a designer, servicing them, I was also a business owner facing the same problems, same marketing and conversion problems. So that's how I learned it. And I read a lot about marketing, copywriting, sales, funnels, all of that. I've learned it from my own businesses, and then I was able to also help my clients. Whether we teach that to our students, we cover that in our web design course. That being said, it's always kind of like a challenge to us because we're in this intersection of these 3 different things, which each of them you can dive really deep into them. Let's take one example, SEO, right? So your website needs to be found on Google. So we have to tell people, oh, there's this thing about SEO, right? But diving into and becoming an SEO professional, it's like being a motion designer.
Right.
People can spend their whole life becoming whatever, SEO expert or copywriter or whatever, conversion rate optimizing. So we do give people an overview of all of the different skills that are necessary, and then they choose actually where they want to go deep. If you're familiar with the T-shaped, either marketer or designer, it's basically the concept of you need to have an overview of a lot of different skills that you're able to understand them, and then you build deep expertise in one of them, and that makes you highly valuable to clients.
Yeah. So that's kind of the concept of a talent stack, which is something I talk about a lot. So if we focus on the design part, what are the differences, if there are any, between the way you approach design if you're working on a brand design project, maybe it's a piece of key art, for a promotion or something like that, versus this is actually a product and you're in Figma and you're laying out the way it's going to look on an iPhone? Like, are those the same skills, or are they different in some way?
I think sometimes it starts off very similarly with playing around with shapes and layouts and trying to make things look good. But when it comes to either apps or websites, there's a lot more complexity that goes into it later on, right? So, we need to make sure that it's responsive and it looks great on all screens, or we need to think what happens after they click here. And actually, what's the interaction? Is there an animation when they hover over this button? What will happen? So there's, you can't tackle everything on the first artboard. You have to kind of like progressively work through this step by step. And sometimes it's an iterative process. You go through this and then you come back and you fix and you rethink things.
Yeah. So like if someone had, traditional graphic design education, and so they understood typography and contrast and all of the basics, and then they get a job designing, products for Google or something like that, what do you think are the things that they're not going to know going in? And like, as an example, I find, I've sort of dabbled in this world a little bit. I'm a motion designer, but I've built products and I've built a million websites now. And it always struck me that in that world, grids are 100 times more important than they are when you're like just designing something cool for a network, right, to promote some show. So are there other things like that, and part of the reason I ask is because I hope that more motion designers learn Webflow, ideally through Flex Academy, and Framer and other things like that, because I think there is a big intersection of these two fields. But what are the things they're not going to know when they get there?
Each one of these things can be deep. Like, for example, you're designing a website and you want to include interactions or animation or motion on the website. So first of all, there's multiple different technologies that allow you to even achieve the same thing. And you have to know what's possible, what's not possible, what's possible, but it's so complicated to achieve that it's not worth your time to try and do this, or what's possible, but it's going to be very, very heavy to load, and that's going to impact load speed. And then having a website that takes a while to load might hurt your business goals. So there's a trade-off there, right? And it's a lot of times there are all of these trade-offs that you try to balance oh, I really care about, the design sensibilities and the interaction and animations, but I also care about achieving the business goals. And there's a cliche, but it's a lot of times it's true.
Right.
When I was working in the startup, one time the CEO had like the idea of doing a competition where everybody designs the landing page for some campaign, and we're going to test it out and see which one of them wins and best converts. And of course, I'm the designer, and now I have to compete against developers and people with zero design sensibilities who are doing horribly ugly things. And guess what? A super ugly design by the developer with a button that's half the side of the page wins. So
it's a painful lesson, isn't it? Like,
yeah. Now we understand that sometimes it's not the pretty design that wins. Okay, does that mean that we always need to go now for the ugly design that converts most? No, it's always a trade-off. You always need to understand that. You give some, you lose some. There's a lot of friction in that. A lot of times between the designer, the developer, the CEO, or the marketer that works on it. I personally love this friction and, arguing, oh no, we need to do this or need to do that. Some people find it difficult and challenging. And, some people, for example, now I see a lot of our Webflow students who are like, you know what? I'm just going to stick to building your websites in Webflow. You send me the design after it was approved and I'll just, develop it. And that's okay. Because they don't want to argue about or try to sell or convince, the client that use this design and not that design. Okay, that's, fantastic. And everybody can pick their own battles, of course. I personally love that, and it's definitely part of the job.
Yeah, I mean, I think there is a version of that in motion design for sure. But I think the big difference is in web design and product design, you can measure how well the thing is working instantly once it's up, which is pretty cool. I want to talk a little bit more about the idea of talent stacks and how all this, kind of links together. So like in my world, if I was going to sort of broadly define, okay, these are the skills a motion designer should have. It's like, okay, design and animation, those are the first two. But then you can start layering things on. You could layer 3D on, which is like a somewhat separate skill set. And then you've got video editing, which turns out is very, very useful. And then you've got the ability to work with audio and doing sound design, which is also really useful. And then you've got business skills. How would you sort of lay out for someone that's interested in web design? What's the talent stack that's going to help you there, aside from knowing Webflow?
Yeah, no. So the first one is I would also start with graphic design as kind of like the foundations, and then some technical skill to allow you to turn that static design into a fully developed website. That can be something that can be coding, like writing HTML, CSS. That can be a tool like Webflow or a tool like Framer. And for others, by the way, that can be a tool like Wix or Squarespace or something that's a little bit more template based, I guess. That kind of hinders creativity a little bit, but it's also a solution for people. So those are kind of like the key skills. Of course, business and understanding marketing, as you've mentioned, is also likely to increase the value that you're able to provide. Animation, just the same. The ability to do things in 3D is also super popular right now in web design, so knowing how to create assets. But in general, image making, which I don't know if you want to put that as part of graphic design, right? Because if you can do whatever, handwritten typography, or if you can take photos, or if you can shoot videos, that can be also highly valuable in web design, because we use images and visuals, right? So some people collaborate with an illustrator or a 3D artist, but some people can do that themselves, and that enables them to do more, impressive work. As I mentioned, animation is now becoming very, very important skill in web design as well. Yeah, custom code. Some people who know custom code allows them to do a lot of cool things, including, by the way, animations and 3D, which is a lot of time on the web are implemented by code. So those are I think, would be the major skill set.
Yeah. Well, let's get into some of the geeky stuff here. So, I'm sure most of the audience has heard of Webflow at least. But Webflow, when it launched, and over the years, it kind of revolutionized, it seems, at least from my perspective, the way websites are built. Prior to that, and I know WordPress is still probably the most widely used platform on earth for websites. But what is it about Webflow that really like caught on in the world of web design? Why is it so popular? Why did you go all in on it and build Flux Academy around it?
So I think Webflow had a new approach to building for the web. So previously you had website builders like Wix or Squarespace, which what they did is they built kind of like a drag and drop builder that basically abstracted the code for you so that you could drag in ready-made components and you can build with them. But the problem with that approach is that it's very easy to do and everybody does that. And, Wix is still, it's like a huge company and a lot of people use it. However, because you have these ready-made components, your creativity is limited to what these components are and what they can do and how you can customize them. And it was either you work with these ready-made components and you're limited, or you learn how to code and then you can do whatever you want, but you have to learn how to code. So those were the options. And Webflow was somewhere in the middle. They basically said, we're going to allow you to code, but instead of writing lines, we created a visual builder for you. So we're going to use the frameworks or the mental models of development, that is using divs, using classes. Like they've basically gave you a UI for HTML elements and CSS elements. I'm not sure if the audience know what HTML and CSS are, but those are the basic web technologies, and they've made them visual. But basically, whatever you can do with these technologies, with HTML and CSS, you can do in Webflow, but you just don't have to write code. You just click on buttons. So that basically bridged the gap, because I don't have to learn how to code and memorize, you have to put a semicolon at the end of the line and blah, 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 and remember all these terms.
Right.
And you can do it visually and you can do it very fast. And it's actually, it writes good code for you, and your creativity is not limited. So that, to me, was a game changer back in the day. It did had a little bit of a learning curve because you had to understand how to think differently. It's not like designers are used with tools like Photoshop or Illustrator or Figma, where you drag layers on an artboard and you put this in front of this to create layers, because the web doesn't work that way. Like the browser doesn't render websites like that. The browser it's more like a Word document. So to understand how to create these layouts, you need to understand the mental models and the concepts of web design, which I've initially struggled with, and I think a lot of designers who come from Illustrator, Photoshop, or design software struggle with, with the mental models. So I was really intrigued by it. It completely changed the way that I worked and what I was able to deliver to my clients without hiring a developer. So I was really excited about this. Back at the time, I was like daily vlogging and almost every day using Webflow and talking about it. At one point, one of their co-founders also came to Tel Aviv, and I went to dinner with him. I was like, how about we partner? And I was like basically selling them. I was like, let's do the Jordan and Nike kind of like partnership. I'm going to be your face.
And you're Michael Jordan in this. I love that.
I'm Michael Jordan in this metaphor, but they're Nike. But to give you the perspective, they were very small. So they also enjoyed being Nike. So I was like, you sponsor my channel. And that worked. They sponsored my channel for a couple of years, and eventually they flew me over to do kind of like a workshop in the US in a big design event. And then I started doing this workshop in Israel, and I saw that there was a lot of demand for these workshops. And eventually I just said, well, it's pretty tiring to say the same workshop again and again. So I just recorded the course. And it blew up. I was, I guess, the right thing at the right time.
I want to help, my audience, who probably most of them have not used Webflow or anything like that. I want them to understand, because I've run headfirst into this. And actually, like right now, we're redoing our website. We're going to have a new School of Motion website pretty soon. It's in Webflow. And our art director, Frank, who's a really, really good designer, has been helping, but he's not a web designer. He's a motion designer who does a lot of brand design stuff for us, but he is helping on this website. And he's running into the same thing I've seen a lot of motion designers run into when they start building a website, which is, I want it to look exactly this way. And it looks perfect. But then the second I change my browser, now it doesn't look good anymore. And if, God forbid, I maximize it on my widescreen, 5K screen, and now it looks really weird. And so, like, you were talking about how, like, web, HTML and browsers, they don't render things like a Photoshop file with, like, layers building up. It renders it, sort of linearly. You can have things on top of each other. How does that work? And what is your mental model for that?
Okay. Yeah. So I've talked about the web having more complexities from the technical side of things, and how we deal with different screen sizes is one of them. So in regular design, graphic design or motion design, you're designing for a fixed format. Like, how many pixels are on that screen at all times. So you can just say, okay, this font size is fixed 50 pixels, and it's always going to be 50 pixels. On the web, you can still use 50 pixels and it will always be 50 pixels. However, there's few more consideration that you need to think about. Number one, 50 pixels might not look good on every screen size. Mm-hmm. Definitely on mobile, it might be too big and you want to, you make it smaller on mobile. But also on desktop, if you change your screen size, maybe 50 pixels is not right size for every size. And I'm talking about font size, but you can think about spacing. For every element, there's spacing between that element and the next element, or the edge of the screen, and so forth. So that's one thing to consider. The other thing that you need to consider is something that is becoming very important in web design is accessibility. So not everybody has the same visual skills, and I don't know if to say skills, but some people are visually impaired. For example, old people have a harder time to read than, younger people. So older people might have on their either mobile screen or their browser a setting that would just make the text larger so that they will have easier time to read. So you might also want to take that into consideration, meaning I think that the body font size should be 16 or 18 pixels. That's like the default. Sure. But what happens if somebody wants to make it bigger? So there's in web design, there's multiple properties. It's not just pixels. It can be percentage based so that, it changes based on the screen size or the element size. It can be relative to the size of the screen. So you can say, for example, this element is 100% of the vertical height, meaning the full browser. And that way I can make sure that I take up your whole screen. So these are relative terms. So again, one approach is to use relative measurements when you're designing. And the other thing is to use measurements, especially in typography, that are relative to the preferences of the user. Right? So we have, for example, a measurement that's called REM, and that's basically relative to the default font size. So let's say a default font size in the browser is 16 pixels. If you do 1, it's going to be 16 pixels. But if you want this to be bigger for a headline, you might do 2 or 3. And if that person wants to increase the font, everything is going to increase relative to that base font size. So yeah, as I've mentioned, there's a lot more complexity to designing for the web.
Yeah. I mean, the way I finally wrapped my head around it, I think, early last year. And it was because there's kind of like this meme on social media with product designers and web designers that really all you guys do is you draw rectangles on a screen. And because, and for everyone listening who doesn't get the joke, when you're like wireframing out a new site or a product, you're not doing a super high fidelity mock-up of it. Usually you're having a rectangle saying, okay, there's going to be an image here. Use a rectangle. And in web design and in Webflow and Framer and every other tool, even Figma now, you can set that rectangle to automatically sort of stretch out to fill the space that you have, or to shrink to contain perfectly whatever content is inside of it. And once you wrap your head around that, it gets a lot easier to sort of predict how things are going to behave, but it's very different. Like nothing in the world of motion design works that way, but it could, and maybe it will one day. So was that like a concept that was difficult, Ron, for you to wrap your head around, like initially, the way things sort of respond?
Yeah, but one more thing to understand is the technology in the web is moving very fast. So all of the things that I've mentioned to you right now, for example, some of them, or maybe a lot of them, were either did not exist or were not important 5, 6, 7 years ago, right? So not to mention that a few years ago, we didn't even have mobile devices, so we didn't have to think about it. But as technology moves, and technology moves very fast, we've got new properties to manage these situations, like all of these relative CSS properties. And then we've got new constraints or demands like the accessibility. Now we also have privacy demands and all of these kind of like new things that the complexity of this thing just grows with time. So when I got started, even when I started teaching Webflow, things were less complex, but complexity expands over time in this area.
Yeah, absolutely. So you mentioned earlier that, you can also in Webflow, you can implement code. It's interesting because like I've gotten to know Webflow like fairly well, and you can do a lot without code. It's kind of wild, like how much you can get away with. And the same in Framer. But both of those tools, if you want to do like the really cool stuff, you kind of do need some code. So how much code, right? Because and there's this movement now. Everyone calls it the no code, movement. And Webflow is a no code tool, meaning you don't have to know how to code. I think that's kind of a misnomer because you don't need to know how to type the code, but you have to understand what the code would be doing. It's, but in any case, can you, like, as let's say a motion designer wants to expand their talent stack to be able to offer web design because they already know how to design and they can animate and they can make these really cool animated things on their websites. Do they need to learn to code? Can you get away without it? Where's the line where all of a sudden, okay, now you just have to learn some JavaScript? Before you hear that answer, I want you to know that the motion design classes we run at School of Motion are not like other online classes. They're interactive with critique on your work from your own personal teaching assistant, a 24/7 engaged community of learners, and some of the best instructors on earth. They're insanely effective, and the results our students get are incredible. So incredible, in fact, that they say things like this.
There's so much information in these courses. The exercises are incredible. In fact, they're all real world. The review process was absolutely enlightening.
I took After Effects Kickstart over the summer, and my TA was just so helpful in like pointing out things that I didn't even think about.
School of Motion courses offer such a compelling experience. The teaching assistants who critique your assignments and clear your doubts are also a part of the industry with tons of experience. But I feel the best part of the School of Motion courses are the student communities.
Curious? Check out our complete motion design curriculum at schoolofmotion.com. Link in the description. All right, back to the episode.
First of all, I don't think that you have to. And I just did a project last month where I've actually learned some of these. There's an animation library, which I don't know if you heard about. It's called GSAP. It's a very, very popular right now. It's probably the most popular animation library, and a lot of people are using that. Although some of these things can be done natively without code in Webflow, the ability to control really fine details of the animation and type animation and that kind of stuff are really, really powerful in this. So a lot of people are learning how to do that right now. But I do want to say two things. Number one, you don't have to do this. This is, again, we've talked about this a little bit early at the beginning before we started recording. The percentage of projects that actually need this niche demand to create this specific cool thing is not large. Most people don't have to do this. It's not a necessity. It's cool. You can do that. It's a bonus, but you don't have to do it. The other thing that I do want to say specifically about code is now with AI tools, you don't really need to know how to code as much as you need to describe what you want. There's now a fantastic AI coding companion for Webflow that I can just basically tell him, hey, I want to do this and this. And he'll just say, okay, here's the code. And it's already connected to your Webflow website. It just works. And if it doesn't work, you tell him it doesn't work and it debugs it. So this area moves very fast. It's helpful to understand, as you've mentioned, some of these concepts and in general, if you understand coding, what coding, how coding works, it's helpful, although you don't have to learn JavaScript or something like that.
Yeah. So you started mentioning animation, so I want to dig into that a little bit. What is the current sort of state of the art about having animation on your websites? Like, what are the tools people are using? What do you recommend when your students are like, I want some cool animation? Like, how is it typically done now?
So there are different technologies that enable you to animate things on the web, and each one of them has pros and cons. So it really depends on what you want. So let's cover a few of them. First of all, there's CSS animation. So CSS, as I've mentioned, it's a core kind of like web technology. It's basically how things look like, right? What size are things? So inherently, you can animate through that. And that enables you to move things around or slide things when you scroll and that kind of things. So that's one thing, and you can animate these properties in Webflow, for example. You can pretty easily move things around that way. Then there are technologies like I've mentioned, GSAP, which is a little bit more robust and interactive, as in you can create timelines and you can create interactions. So when I click this happens and these things move and these loop, or it goes and it goes back. So that's another way to animate things by referencing them by code and creating timelines and things like this using code. Then there's a technology that is called Lottie. Lottie is was invented by the team at Airbnb to take in animations, vector animation that you do in After Effects, and you put them on a web or in an app, and you can either play the animation or you can work with it, as in, for example, this thing animates as you scroll through the page. So you can also reference what keyframe you're in the file as you're scrolling. So that's for example, that's technology that's good for vector animations. You've also mentioned Rive, which is kind of like the next level after Lottie. That's also good for vector animation, but it allows you more interactivity to play around with the animation. It's not just like a movie that plays. You can also, it can look where you are moving, or it can react to things that happen on the screen. So that's another technology. 3D, as I've mentioned, is very, very popular right now. So we have Spline, which is basically a 3D software that enables you to embed 3D objects or scenes in your website and also make them respond or interact or animate based on things that happen on the website. There's 3JS, which is also a coding technology for implementing 3D scenes. And it's kind of like the professional version of, Spline. And in general, there's a technology that's called WebGL that enables graphics. You can call it graphics, right? There's all types of animations and transitions and all kinds of, things to happen. Particles, all that kind of like crazy stuff that can be rendered dynamically on the web. So a lot of technical options. You need to know what you're trying to do, and then you can pick the right technology, I would say, depending on what you try to do. And each one of them is deep. Like, you can dive deep into each one of them.
Yeah. So that's awesome. I've been talking a lot on this channel lately about Rive because it's a great animation tool, but it also, to me, kind of bridges that gap. You can do things with it that would require code prior, things that you can't do in Lottie. But one question, and we were talking about this a little bit before we started recording, is that most websites don't need animation, but it seems to be very, very popular right now. So I'm curious if you have a philosophy about like when it's appropriate to do animation on a website, and how do you kind of think about that?
There's animation that is just like, for example, things sliding into view and just makes the experience of browsing more delightful. For example, buttons, when you hover over a button and it changes a color, for example, that's functional because you know now that it's clickable or what it does, right? So I would separate these types of interactions and animation with animations that are more storytelling related, right? So they're more to show who you are as a brand and create like a playful experience and that kind of thing. Not everybody needs them. It really depends, right? It really depends on the brand, right? If a brand, for example, a brand like Apple uses a lot of 3D animations. You scroll through the page and the iPhone, whatever, turns around and it zooms in, or it kind of like deconstructs and you can see what's inside. So they do use animations to show their product and to create kind of like a wow effect. So that's definitely valuable. For example, Apple would probably not use Rive because that's just not the brand that they need. Kind of like vector animation, specifically, I think, right? So they're more in the 3D realistic animation, perhaps, right? Or video. And by the way, we didn't talk about video, but video plays a big part in web design. The more now that internet speeds are great, people are just playing videos. So I know that now a lot of designers just show a show reel, like a video show reel of their works in their portfolio the minute that you're landing on it. So there's a lot of motion design that goes into that, but it's just a video. So it's not an animation technology, right? It's just an embedded video on a website. So I'm trying to think about, again, in the context of Rive, they gave the example of Duolingo, which is a brand that is very, very playful. Because it's very illustrative based, it would make sense to create these playful interactions using technology like that. So I think that it's just, with that kind of technology, you're limited to brands that are vector illustrative based and playful, which is a sub niche. I'm not saying there's not a lot of brands like this, but those would be I think, the brands that would benefit from this specific technology. And the gaming industry. Again, gaming industry is a huge industry that makes more money than Hollywood. So it's not to be ignored. And there's a lot of money in gaming. So I think that's where this technology is most beneficial.
Yeah, that's interesting. So I'm pretty familiar with Rive, less familiar with Spline and the other things you talked about. Rive actually can import bitmap graphics and it can work with those too. So you can kind of do whatever you want. But I guess like the bigger question is always, what should you be doing, right? And like a big eye opener for me was like when I started building little apps in Bubble and learning Framer and Webflow. As an animator, my initial instinct is, what's the craziest, neatest thing that can happen when you click this button, right? But then there's this concept of UX, user experience. Maybe that's not what should happen. Maybe it should be very subtle. And maybe there's even things I've heard, you probably would know better, but like, when you hover over something, you don't want to wait 3 seconds for the animation to finish, right? It's like, it's measured in milliseconds, like 50 milliseconds or something. So I feel like there's a little bit of a sensibility shift that has to happen if you're animating something for the web. Do you have any philosophy about, like, I don't know, maybe if we're talking specifically about animation that's used in the UI, for example? Yeah,
you've nailed it. That's the most common pitfall. Don't make me wait. Some people create animation even just like, you slide in and then things happen, or you go into the website and there's crazy transitions and it starts telling you a story and animates, hey, this is me. And okay, I'm like, I want to scroll and read the website. Don't get me stuck in this kind of like welcome experience. I don't want to watch it right now. It's a website. I want to scroll through it. And you're getting penalized for doing things like that in terms of load speed and Google ranking. So yeah, it's on the web. It's mostly about speed.
Mm-hmm. What are your students getting interested in things like Spline? We talked a little bit about Spline before we started recording. I mean, Webflow, I think famously in this world, like when they relaunched their website recently, they had this amazing sort of hero artwork from Spline that was 3D and it was clickable and all of that. That takes a lot of work to do. Is that stuff that that your students are looking to get into, or do you think that's more of an opportunity for like our students to work with web designers to do?
So number one, I think 3D on the web is big and it's very trendy right now, and we see a lot of interest around that. I think with Spline specifically, and of course, first of all, the fact that Webflow integrated with Spline natively allows people to integrate 3D scenes and, again, interact with them natively. That means that they're in a way betting big on Spline and this technology. And there's a lot of interest in that. My experience, and I've recorded kind of like a crash course on our YouTube that has done pretty well. But while I was doing this, I've noticed that, again, in terms of performance, it actually slows the website down. And that's the reason that this happens right now is that because they're hosting the 3D scene actually on their website. So you're actually, it's not on your website, you're calling them.
Yeah.
And that takes time and there might not be as fast as you are, and then it comes back. And so this slows things down a little bit. And when I asked around on Twitter, there was actually a lot of people who've mentioned, yeah, you know what, this is really exciting technology, but I can't use it right now on real projects because of performance issue. So that kind of made me hesitant whether, I know that there's a lot of demand for it, and I know a lot of people are excited about it, and I can teach it, but do I actually make the recommendation for them to actually use it? But then what happened is that as I was doing this, Spline had a very big launch or announcement of a new technology of how to integrate Spline into mobile apps and the Vision Pro, kind of like augmented reality scenes. And it looks like they're making a bet on these technologies, maybe similar to how you've mentioned Rive has been used in, app contexts. And what's interesting is that when when an app developer uses Spline, unlike a web designer, they allow the app developer to host the scene on their own servers to avoid these performance issues. So my gut feeling is that they're just betting on this space of either mobile or AR space, and they're making a bet on that and not necessarily betting on the web for web design. Maybe I'm wrong, and maybe they will solve this issue. And also maybe I had this issue because I don't know how to model correctly or efficiently enough. Because when you're doing it for the web, it's not just about how it looks. It's also about how can we do this to load fast. So for example, how you model, if you use a lot of facets or edges, or I'm not sure about the terminology. That would affect.
You want low poly count is what you're aiming at. Yeah.
Exactly. You want low poly count, and the materials that you're using and the lighting setup that you have, you really need to make it efficient. So perhaps I don't have that knowledge on how to make efficient scenes that loads fast. And maybe that's also something that just needs to be considered when you're building using that technology.
Yeah, that's great, man. I mean, that's a really good example, because I think that's the kind of stuff that like motion designers, if they take our 3D classes, we're teaching them about that. It's less important in the context of motion design that you're modeling perfectly, with like the lowest
Although it
possible
probably
polygon.
affects render times, I assume.
It definitely does, but like if it's going to add an extra 15 seconds per frame or something, and in the end you're just rendering a video, not a huge deal. In the world of video games, it's one of the most important things you can focus on, right? Is like getting that poly count down. And now there's a lot more real-time sort of motion design happening. Yeah, you made me think so one interesting thing about Rive, and until you explained the issue that you found with Spline, it didn't really occur to me how important this was. So one of the things Rive has done is they've open sourced their renderer. They built their own renderer so that if you can download a Rive file and you can implement this renderer in your app. I have a bubble app that uses Rive, and I'm hosting the Rive file, and it's calling the library somehow, but it's instantaneous. It's really, really fast. But that makes it a lot harder to implement. It's so much easier to just copy the embed code and then just paste that into Webflow, and there it is. But there's a performance hit there. And I think there's a lot of these technologies I don't really understand, like WebAssembly. I keep hearing about that, and WebGL that you mentioned. So do you have the sense that like some of this stuff, it's really, really cool, but we're just a little bit early and it's not actually going to be that commercially useful yet? Or is it, it just requires a little more effort right now?
I think that where we are right now, there's already things that are being used, but it's very similar to how I've mentioned Webflow. And previously there's been like Wix or coding and lacking something in between. So today, you can do everything with custom code, right? So you can build amazing high performance 3D scenes with 3.js and create amazing experiences that are highly performant. But it requires a lot of technical knowledge. Yeah. And I think Spline are trying to solve that and make it just more accessible for the everyday guy to create, design, and then implement. And I think Rive is probably trying to do the same. So it's getting there. And I think that I haven't seen many application, like real world application in production of either Spline or Rive, but I think it's coming.
Yeah, it does feel early. Where do you think, one of the things I'm hoping that our audience takes away from this is that there's a fair amount of crossover, I think, between the worlds of web design, product design, and motion design. Like we have a lot of alumni that work at Google and work at video game companies. And, you mentioned the video game industry. That's actually a big place that Rive is focused, because apparently the tooling for making the user interface for games is pretty bad right now. And so they're trying to solve that. And so that's an example of like, okay, that's an opportunity for a motion designer who's really good at animating, maybe never thought about video game menus as like a niche that could have a lot of potential there. Are there things like that you're seeing in the world of web design or maybe even product design where you're like, if you're a good animator and you understand some of this stuff, there's an opportunity here?
I've mentioned one of the interesting things that I'm seeing right now, which is very popular in web design right now, is GSAP, which again, it's an animation library, code library, but you're animating and you're doing timelines and you're doing everything that you're doing in After Effects, but you're just doing it logically instead of visually. You're writing. Takes this thing and animate it from point A to point B. You're writing the numbers. This is definitely exploding right now, and I'm seeing a lot of demand for that. But so if you already have the skills of how to animate, and not how to animate as in how to use After Effects to move this box from here to here, as in that you take this element and you move it in this duration and this easing to here while this moves and change color and changes size, that would create a great animation. Lacking in people who have the animation,
art form of animation, yeah,
vision, exactly, yeah. And then it doesn't matter, like somebody needs to implement it, right? So in the web, people will implement it with code rather than in After Effects. But the process that happens right now is that a designer, whether it's a motion designer or not, doesn't matter, will create a mock-up in After Effects, and it will send it to a developer who will basically translate what he sees into code. Right? So it's a two-people process. If you take the time to learn this thing, for example, and do how to do the implementation, then that's valuable. And I think a lot of people now are excited about being able to implement their vision.
Yeah, gotcha. That's interesting. But I keep bringing up Rive. I can't help it. I'm kind of obsessed with that tool right now. That's I've spoken with the CEO, and that's what you just described is the problem that they're trying to solve, which is that is the way that like most animation, even in products and stuff now, even at Google, this is how they do it. An After Effects artist animates it. It should work this way. Here's a list of all the easing values, and it's this many
milliseconds. By the way, when I worked in startups, which was like, over 10 years ago, we used to do animation mockups in Flash. That's when Flash existed, and we used to do like including sometimes doing kind of like action script to say, when you click this button, then you play this timeline and this is how it moves. And then we would send these animation files, Flash files, to the developer, who would then go ahead and develop it. But yeah, that's basically what we did.
Yeah.
And so if we had Rive back in the day, that was pretty cool.
Yeah. To me, that seems like kind of the future of these tools, and Spline as well. Like once the technology kind of catches up to the vision of it, you know, I think it just seems like a more intuitive workflow for an animator to give the developer something that works right then and doesn't have to be rebuilt, or we have to reverse engineer what you did. And I think there's always going to be a certain amount of that. You know, when you get really complex interactions, you're going to have someone coding it. Yeah, but that's interesting. And okay, so it sounds like the current opportunity that you see for like someone in my audience is you already know how to animate, which is the hard thing to learn, right? Probably I would imagine the same way learning Webflow is actually much easier than learning to be a good web designer. You know, and learning design.
That is true.
Yeah.
The way, like most people get to us, they buy the Webflow course first, and then they like build a website, and then we tell them, that's fantastic, but your website looks like crap.
Right.
So yeah, I think we should take the design course now.
Yeah. We have a very similar trajectory. Yeah. People come to learn After Effects. It's a Trojan horse, right? Like people come to learn After Effects and then they learn it and then they're like, my work isn't good. Oh, it's because you didn't learn to animate yet. And you don't know how to design, you know, and you layer those things and all of a sudden you can make pretty cool stuff. So, okay. So the last thing I wanted to get into with you, Ron, you know, the number one topic in my industry right now is AI. You know, as of this recording, I think it was about a week ago, Sora just released some new videos showing like little short films that filmmakers made, and they're incredible. Like, it's funny, but before Sora was announced, I think I did this podcast episode where I said, I don't think these AI video things are ever going to be good enough to use professionally. I just don't see how it's possible. And then about a month later, Sora came out. I'm like, I'm wrong. Okay. But in the world of web design and coding, I mean, it's already had a massive impact. Like huge. So how does that affect?
By the way, I just want to interject and say, it might, while tools like Sora are going to be able to replace, I think, the stock websites that motion designers or video editors were using to get their footage from, but they're not going to replace, I think, the motion designers and the editors, because to put that together into cohesive story, especially when you need typography to tell that story, or you know, put in some product, and put that all together into a good video, I think there's going to be a while before that happens. So again, I'm a big user of AI for both imagery and code and whatnot, but to be able to put that together, it's going to. Yeah. Designers will have a job for a while, I think.
I agree with you. I mean, I think what blew me away about Sora was just the fidelity of the video. I thought, you know, I can't really imagine a 1 minute seamless, perfectly photoreal video being created by these things just based on how they work and what I've learned about how they work. It just seems like impossible. And I was wrong about that. But I do agree with you that there still has to be someone deciding what to make. You know?
Yeah.
And I think, you know, the tools can help with that too, and they can give you ideas and all of that. But in the end, someone has to pick what's the best thing and how do I tweak it? Yeah.
Look, the thing is this. You have a vision in your head. Now you need a tool to help you execute on that vision. So these AI tools, let's think about animation. And again, I've been doing animation using AI throughout the whole month because it helped me write the GSAP code for animating. So I was like, take this headline, and when I scroll to this position, stagger the letters one after another, and it wrote the code to me. But at some point, explaining what you want becomes so tedious and time consuming that it would just be easier to do it on your own. So if you think about a motion design where this rectangular moves through the space and turns into a circle and changes color, and also typography goes, if you try to describe what happens there, it will take more time than doing it in After Effects at some point. Right. So not everything is going to be efficient.
Yeah, I think I've said that too. It's like the amount of control that you need in a professional environment where the client, like, can you nudge that 3 pixels to the left? I mean, the amount of control you need does not exist in any form in these tools yet. And by the time they build that in, you're right. At some point, it's faster to just do it. but
no, you might have. By the way, you might have some kind of an AI plugin or prompter inside After Effects that's going to help you do an initial setup or animate something, and it'll speed you up. But it's not going to replace. You need After Effects to do a professional scene.
Yeah, yeah, and I think also too. I mean, it's probably different with websites, but one thing that occurred to me is, all of these tools, they're built on needing gigantic amounts of data to train on to be able to do this. And so if you're talking about video, well, there's, probably trillions of hours of video on YouTube and things like that. But if you're talking about, let's say, like 2D animation, like traditional hand-drawn animation, there's only so much of that stuff. And if you're like, show me a 2D hand-animated, snake that's, doing the horror, then, well, how many things like that are there to even train an AI on it? So I still think that animation is somewhat more insulated than video. I do think stock websites are going to be completely different in about 5 years. But how is this impacting the world of like people who, they're professional Webflow designers, right? And they build websites for people. Does this just make their job faster and easier and you can get more done? Or is there some risk of a client can just go to this service and pay $50, describe, I have a pizza shop, and then the Webflow site's done?
No. The people who are either at risk, but I don't think that they are at risk, is the Wix, right? Because people who work with a professional designer and pays them $10,000, $20,000, $30,000 to build a complex website do not want to go to an AI and start prompting and do it on their own. That's why they pay you, because they don't have time to do it and they need a professional who they trust to do. So that's not at risk. What's at risk is clients who anyway would pay $10 to build their own websites on Wix, and they're like, oh, that's crappy. There's a better way to do that. I can do that with an AI. So they're at risk. I don't really think that they're at risk because they're a big company and they're going to just implement it and change, and they're already doing it, and change how they work. But that's how, that's the type of people that are going to do that. I never think that a client who used to pay you, I don't know, thousands of dollars for a spot is now going to try to do it on their own. It's just different people. Maybe people who were used to go on Fiverr and hire somebody for $50 trying to get some kind of a spot would now think, hey, let me try and do that myself. But professionals, I think they're just going to start using it. I used to use a lot of stock photography sites. I don't use them anymore. So that has been completely replaced for me. So stock photography, you said in 5 years, again, for me, in terms of photography, that's already dead today. For video, you said 5 years. 5 years is a lot. Yeah. I would bet on 1 to 2 years until they're dead. Music as well. I don't know if you've seen Sonu, I think it's called.
I played with some of them, yeah.
Oh my God, that was like, I can even do songs in Hebrew. Anyway.
That's amazing.
It's crazy. So music, it's crazy. It's like soon you won't be even able to tell on Spotify who's real and who's AI. It's crazy. But again, for the professional, for me, it's just in the web design space, again, for me, what it changed is image making, which I now use AI tools for image making. And being able to, so that just instead of paying one service, I'm paying a different service. Yeah. But coding, for example, was something that was really not accessible to me because I just don't know how to code. And I wouldn't start even trying to do that on my own. And now I can do it. So that just opened up a whole new possibilities for me that I was just not able to do before. And that's very cool.
One thing that I'm a little worried about, but I feel like it may not need to be. I'm curious what your take is that when you're established and you already have skills, these AI tools make you, they can take you from like a 1x web designer to a 10x web designer, because now you can just ask ChatGPT for which code achieves this certain thing. And you can go into Midjourney and describe exactly the thing you want, and there it is, and it's beautiful, and you don't need to also be an amazing, designer, visual designer. But what if you're starting out, right? And you kind of need some of that low-level work to get your, to cut your teeth, get your foot in the door in the industry. And those are the things that AI kind of replaces, right? you know, like I'm trying to think. I mean, one of my first jobs ever was an assistant editor. I worked at a post-production house in Boston. And so a lot of my day was spent just like putting tapes into a machine and logging them, like basically just writing out what this shot is, what this shot is. That's all going to be automated, like sooner or later, you know? But that was the way in. That was the way into the video editing profession. And so now there's a different way in. It's a little trickier, to be honest. Do you think that could happen in web design?
I think specifically in web design, there's just now so many great free resources, templates, UI kits that allow people free. Mm-hmm. And these AI tools, for example, Framer has already implemented an AI builder into Framer. So they call it Start with AI. So you basically prompt what you need for a website. They would wireframe the whole thing. They would write all the copy. They would create all the sections. Basically, you need to pick colors and fonts and replace the images. So it's today, basically on day one, you could do probably what people used to take 3 years of experience to do on day one. I do agree with you, and that's a broader cultural insight or concern that because things are just so easy with AI, a lot of people are going to struggle going through the tough period of skill acquirement. And it's not, again, related to design in particular. Like today, again, when I was blown away by this music creation tool, I thought to myself, who is going to now bother trying to record their own crappy song from scratch? Because I can take the same lyrics and just plug it in, write the style, and it would produce a much better song. So how are beginners going to be able to compete with that? And I don't know the answer to that. But I'm a believer in humanity. And I think that, I don't know, either we have a backlash or we have, you know, the pendulum always swings. So now we have this kind of like AI and makes professional looking work easy. So what everybody is going to want is not professional looking work, crappy work that was done by hand and proven to be not machine made. I don't know. You know, it's probably the pendulum always swings. That's what I think in terms of design trends, you know. In the 90s, Photoshop was introduced, and then we had grunge, like, oh, we don't want things to be clean and nice. Let's ruin it. So it's always, and then flat design. No, not flat design. Like,
yeah, skeuomorphism is making a comeback.
Yeah,
so, yeah,
exactly. So but I don't know. I mean, who knows? I'm not an oracle.
Check out fluxacademy.com or subscribe to their YouTube channel to learn more about the world of web design, Webflow, Framer, and the endless rabbit hole that is that industry. I really want to thank Ron for coming on. I always love talking to him, and I hope you learned something useful in this conversation. Make sure you're subscribed to our YouTube channel if you are not, because we have so many great guests lined up and tons of content coming soon that you will not want to miss. That's it. Until next time.